Joseph Lovett, I mean, you have your own production company from 1989.
Yes.
And if I read well, your first documentary was in 1977.
Yes.
About
Parents of gays.
parents of gays.
And it was for CBS News. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and also you were nominated for an Emmy, and you got a Peabody Award.
Yeah.
You
Mm-hmm.
made, a lot of documentaries.
Yes.
So you've been working in this field for how many years now?
Well, my entire professional life. I've been working in the field since I was 23, and I'm now 75. So it's 52 years. That's something.
That's a pretty long experience, I guess.
So I'd started. I'd gone to film school at Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
and I never finished because it was 1968. It was during the Columbia strike, and I left Columbia at the end of a billy club, and I didn't feel like going back for a second year. And then I started working when I was 23, and I worked mostly as an assistant editor, and then an editor, and then a producer. And the piece that you mentioned, Parents of Gays, was the first piece that I produced for CBS. And it was about how does a family deal with the son coming out. And everything that had been on network television before then had been extremely negative about homosexuals and gay people. And it was, they never even used the word gay in those days. And, homosexuals were equated with drug addicts and prostitutes in the news for the most part. And so this is the first time that a piece had ever been aired about, plain old people that happened to be gay. And our expert, the head of the American Psychiatric Association at the time, Judd Marmer, by this time, homosexuality had been declassified as a psychiatric disorder. Mm-hmm. And that was in 1973. So this is 77. And he said, the psychiatrist said, homosexuality is not the illness. It's homophobia. That's the illness. That's the problem. And there's no reason that somebody can't be a perfectly happy, well-adjusted, homosexual. So that was revolutionary, actually. And because usually some of the pieces that had been on television before then were documentaries about homosexual people was horrible. I mean, horrible. And it's hard to imagine. So that was a big deal. And I was very proud to have done that. And that got me producing, because I presented that to go from editor to producer, mm-hmm. Which was not very common in those days. I needed to present a story that I could do better than anyone else. And because I was openly gay, I could say, listen, I know this story, and I can do a better job of it than anybody else. I know the nuances, and let me do it. And luckily they did. So that was the beginning of my career as a producer. And I was there for a couple of years, and then I went on to 2020. 2020 had opened, and it was a show with a more prominent time slot, and in prime time, and it was a wonderful opportunity. I spent 10 years there, and when I was at 2020, the AIDS epidemic had begun, and again, because I was openly gay, I could pitch that story, which wasn't well received. It was about a year and a half that I had to spend begging my senior producers and executive producers to let me do the story that was so important. And Larry Kramer, who just died, do you know who Larry Kramer is?
No.
All right, well, Larry Kramer was, he was the founder of Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York, the first social service organization. He was the founder of ACT UP in New York.
Oh,
And Larry was single-handedly pushed the press coverage of AIDS. And not only the press coverage, but he got to push the government to act, organize people to take to the streets. And he was an extraordinary person. And he was a neighbor of mine, and he would rap on my door every day saying, you know, why the fuck aren't you doing something? Why isn't your company doing something? Meaning ABC. And it was his persistence hammering me that got me to be able to continue to hammer the people at work until they finally relented and let me do the story. And then after that, it was so successful that they pretty much gave me carte blanche to do pretty much anything I wanted on AIDS.
And I see, I mean, you made several documentaries, but
Yeah.
I like 3 subjects, like about the Jewish community, the gay community, and health.
Yes, a lot of health.
And
Yeah.
why are you so much into health? You talk about cancer, going blind,
Yeah.
um,
ALS. Yeah. AIDS. Well, I've always thought health is intrinsically dramatic. It's, I mean, what's more important than a person's health? What's more important than returning somebody from sickness to health? And it's just inherently dramatic. Mm-hmm. So I've always been interested in health. I come from a large family. Large families have a lot of health issues. And my father died when I was very young of cancer. My mother had cancer and was cured as a young woman. And I was always interested in extreme health. I'm also interested in taboo subjects, and I like to demystify taboo. And I don't like secrets, and I'm not good with them. So I think they're unhealthy. So I've realized over the years that a lot of the story material that I've gone after has been about demystifying taboo. And it's also been about introducing people that may not be thought about too much to mainstream people so that they know more about it. And like AIDS was the ultimate, really, I think, because, AIDS dealt with sex, which American people don't like to talk about. It dealt with death, which American people don't like to talk about. And it talked about homosexuality, same-sex sex, which people didn't like to talk about. And so, it was a different world in 1981, 82, 83. And so I wanted to talk about those things, and you had to talk about those things if we're going to confront that epidemic. So that's what I did. And it's funny because my latest film, Children of the Inquisition,
yeah,
I hadn't thought about it when I started to do it, but it's also a taboo subject.
And how did you choose such a subject?
I chose it, well, I'd always been interested in it since I was a boy. When I was 13, our rabbi, a Jewish boy is bar mitzvahed at 13, and it takes a good deal of study and presentation for the bar mitzvah. And the year that I was to be bar mitzvahed, our rabbi went on sabbatical and asked me if I would wait until he came back. I loved him very much. He was very involved with the civil rights movement. He was a terrific, inspirational figure. And this was 1958. And so I paid attention to what he was doing on sabbatical. And one of his projects was to go to Spain to interview the descendants of the Marrano people, and to try to understand what, if they had any sense of their Jewish background and all that kind of thing. And no one would talk to him. No one. And of course, this was 1958. It was Franco Spain, a very Catholic Spain. was rather soon after the Holocaust, and nobody who didn't have to wanted to talk about being Jewish or being associated with being Jewish. So he came back and he gave a sermon that I remember vividly, and this was, a long time ago. And the sermon was called Todos Católicos. Everybody's Catholic. We've always been Catholic. And he talked about how the shadow of the Inquisition loomed so dark over present-day Spain that no one would dare consider having an ounce of Jewish blood. And it fascinated me. It just fascinated me how something that had happened 500 years ago, which is a much longer time to a 13-year-old than it is to a 75-year-old. Yeah. It just fascinated me that something like that could have such an extraordinary effect on contemporary culture. And pardon?
In which way?
Well, that people could still be fearful, that the Inquisition the thought of it still created fear, so much that you couldn't even think about ancestors having been Jewish. You wouldn't want that association. And in fact, even today, the idiom to defame someone in Spanish is to colgar el San Benito, is to put a San Benito on them. The San Benito was the robe with the cross of St. Andrew to mark, and with a hat to mark the penitent. So it's pretty strong. It's pretty strong. But then things changed. In 1965, Pope John the 23rd had Vatican II, and Vatican II exculpated the Jews for the death of Jesus. Huge step, because before then, every Sunday, my Catholic friends would be told that I was responsible for the death of Jesus. And I was responsible, not just me, but my entire lineage, and whoever I wound up having would be responsible for the death of Jesus. The Jews were damned. Well, that stopped, or officially it stopped. That made a big difference in anti-Semitism. And then in 1992 was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, where he discovered the New World.
Yeah.
So what people didn't know, in fact, what I hadn't known, was that Columbus was leaving on the very same week that the Jews were being expelled. So in the harbor, he was leaving the harbor with these ships that were going off to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to Portugal, and for Jews that were not going to accept conversion, but wanted to keep their Jewish identity. And Columbus had been funded by wealthy conversos. And I often wondered, were they just looking for the riches of the East, or might they also have been looking for a safe haven? So with the 500th anniversary, there were a lot of stories on television and newspapers about what happened 500 years ago in 1492, meaning Columbus, but it also brought up the expulsion of the Jews. So all of a sudden, this is like 40 years after my rabbi had been trying to do this research. The grandchildren of the people he had been trying to interview could say, well, isn't that interesting? I wonder if that's why no one in my family ever went to church. I wonder if that's why my family doesn't eat pork or doesn't eat shellfish. I wonder if that's why they have these strange customs when people die. And so all of a sudden, rather than being a stigma, it became a curiosity. And so
like an unknown secret.
An unknown secret, of course. Mm-hmm. And because 10% of the Spanish population had been Jewish. 10% of the Roman Empire had been Jewish. So, so it opened up a world to me that hadn't been opened to my rabbi. And I was allowed to, I had the privilege of talking to people about their families. And so when I started, I thought that I would meet people who could trace their ancestry maybe back to the 1700s. And then I would have an expert consider what might have happened and all the way back to the Inquisition. Well, instead, I found people that trace their ancestry back to the 1300s and 1400s. And it was amazing that people were able to trace their lineage so carefully. And there were records. I mean, there were extraordinary records. Dorian Carvajal, whose family was from Segovia. Carlos de Medeiros, whose family was originally from Lisbon. And he's a Brazilian. And that these people had, they had converted, but there were traces of Jewish culture that had been left in their families for generations. And what was also interesting is that these converts, these new Christians as they were called, often married one another, married the same families married, so that, or families with the same background married, so that these customs were maintained. Like Carlos, my friend from Rio, to this day, all the men, and they're Catholic, he comes from a very, very staunch Catholic family. All the boys are circumcised. Their family does not eat pork, they do not eat shellfish, and they do not mix milk and meat. So they follow these Jewish laws, but the meaning of it became a custom rather than a law, and it lost its religious, its spiritual meaning. So it was really fascinating. So so we follow about 6 people, some whose family became Jewish again, some who had remained Jewish, and from all over the world, from the Ottoman Empire, from Spain, from Latin America,
So do you consider that your film, it's beyond this taboo, it's about identity?
Very much about identity. Yeah, I was not interested in making a film just for Jews. You know, there are a lot of great Jewish documentary series here in America, and I imagine elsewhere too. But it's often Jews talking to Jews about Jews. And that wasn't my interest. I wanted an open tent, because this is the history that changed the world. I mean, these were events that literally changed the world, and people did not want to talk about them. You know, those who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism did so because they wanted to be safe, and they wanted to remain safe for generations, for centuries. And I think for those who had remained Jewish, if things were quiet and nobody was going after them to kill them, they didn't want to talk about it.
So why did they circumcise themselves? Because that's too risky if you want to hide your identity.
They came up with excuses. Oh, the foreskin was too tight. Oh, there was an infection. Oh, there was this, that, or the other. Yeah, it's excuses.
But they did that being like at the 8th day, or
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And are you still religious at any?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh no, not at all.
At all.
Not at all. No, I mean, I identify as Jewish, but I certainly don't believe in God. No, I mean, no.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. And I had a religious education. I had a strong religious education, but I just never, because of how the world is and events in my life, I stopped believing in God very young. And and I firmly do not believe in God. And I'm an Orthodox atheist. And I would go to the temple for various holidays or family bar mitzvahs or whatever, and I certainly knew all the prayers and all of that. But one day at a great nephew's bar mitzvah, I'm participating in the service, and then I said to myself as I was reading these prayers or reciting these prayers that I don't believe a word of it. I mean, not a word. And what was I doing, saying things that I didn't believe? So I stopped.
And having the long and successful career that you have, how difficult or easy is for you to make a project?
It's agony.
Yeah.
Agony. Yeah, it's horrible.
It's not easier nowadays than in the past for you, or how does it work?
No, wouldn't that be nice? That would be so nice if it got easier. No, it's always agony. It's every time I finish a film, and this Children of the Inquisition was 10 years in the making. 10 years. 10 years. And the first proposal was written 20 years ago. So that's how long it took. And, there's the raising money for it, and then you run out of money, you have to go do something else, then you come back to it and all that kind of thing. It's agony. And like, I wanted to do this project very badly. I was getting older and I figured I better do it before I died. Mm-hmm. It's a very complicated story because, just because of the nature of the story, people converted, they took on different names. They of course became Catholic, but they became sort of Catholic, some of them became very Catholic. And then after a few generations living as Catholics with a certain name, a certain Catholic name, usually a very Catholic name, many of them then went to Amsterdam with the Reformation, and they declared their Jewish identity 3-4 generations later. And then they had to get into the Jewish community in Amsterdam. These are crazy stories. And then they came to the New World, or they might have come to the New World before as conversos, but when they got to the New World, they might have been a little loose about their Catholicism because so many of the colonizers in the New World were conversos. They say 25 to 50% of the colonizers were new Christians, were former Jews. Often within a generation, they had just converted. So just to figure out who's who and where they are and all that kind of thing was very, very difficult. And all these different things were happening at the same time. The story of the Jews from Spain to Portugal, the Jews from Spain to Italy, and then to Austria, and then to East Europe, and the Jews from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, the Jews from Portugal and Spain to the New World. It was totally befuddling. And in a way, I was sort of lucky that it took so long to raise the money to do the film fully, because it gave me time to think more about it and to understand more about how much I didn't know and how much I had to learn,
Do you know about the stories about those Jews that probably were in Israel or abroad and kept the keys from their homes in Toledo and went back?
I have heard these stories, but no one ever showed me a key. I have heard these stories, but I've never seen such a key.
And going back to taboos and health,
mm-hmm.
Do you perceive any taboo regarding what we are living today with the coronavirus?
I don't as yet. I don't. I think people people otherize, right? And they make other people other, and very easily.
Yeah.
And so I think if someone is a threat to you, or you perceive them as a threat to you, you'll otherize them. So I think that it will happen. If it's not happening and I just haven't noticed, if it is happening, I haven't noticed it, perhaps. But I think to some degree that'll happen. But
It happened a little bit with the Chinese.
yes, that's true. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yep. Well, it's so interesting. I already lived through the AIDS epidemic, and throughout the world, one group would say it was someone else's problem. When in the United States, it was gay people that were the problem, and then in China, we went to the first AIDS conference in China, a bunch of us from the United States, to talk to them about what our experience had been, and they were, so many of the people there were saying, "Oh, it's a foreigner's disease. It's not a Chinese disease," and it was so interesting. But you look at the quote Spanish flu, which started in 1918 or so. That started in Kansas. You look at gonorrhea, which was the French disease or the Spanish disease, depending upon which country you were living in. So we've always blamed others for our epidemics.
And personally speaking, how are you doing this?
Pardon?
On a personal basis, how you're living with this this context? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jim, my husband, and I, we live in Soho in New York City. We've been careful. We're very lucky in that we have a very comfortable home. We have a garden. So if you're going to be quarantined, this is a nice place to be quarantined. And my work colleague is working from her home in Brooklyn. We Zoom like we are every day. We've been extraordinarily productive. I mean, I think we've been perhaps more productive over this time than we ever have. If there's something about Zoom that gets you to focus, and it's been good. It's been really good. We've relaunched our film Gay Sex in the 70s. We've done a lot of work. We have an ongoing educational program with our film Going Blind, and with doctors and communities. And last night we had our first online screening of Children of the Inquisition. It was very successful. So I think this new world of constriction is actually, for people like me and people like you, we're allowed to. It's giving us actually a much broader platform and a much larger audience. I mean, there were people that watched the film last night from their homes all over the world that would never have gotten to a screening if it had been at a community center or a house of worship or even at a theater. I mean, this is really extraordinary. And also older people who might be not well enough to travel, not well enough to leave their home, they could see it. And we got a number of responses about that and how grateful they were. I mean, this is fantastic.
Yeah, true. That's a good point. And how do you feel, I mean, being so into media yourself, how do you feel that media is dealing with the coronavirus as a subject?
Well, thank God we have the media, because we don't have a government. And if the media wasn't there telling people what was going on and reporting from the proper scientists, people would have no idea. I mean, our government is meaning our president, is going out of his way to, act as if, pretending everything's okay. And it's not good for us, as you can see from our statistics.
Oh, of course not. And And do you have any?
Do you hear Jim singing in the background?
No,
Oh, okay, good.
no, that's probably. And you have any project at least in mind?
I do. I do. I I don't know. I really felt after the Inquisition, this project was exhausting on many different levels, and the Inquisition project, that is. And once we had finished it, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and if I wanted to do, or was I able to do. I mean, where was I in my life, and my state of mind, and my energy, and all of that. So I figured that what I really wanted to do was concentrate on getting the work that I'd already done out to people that could use it, because so much of what I've done, we did this film called Gay Sex in the 70s, the Going Blind, a lot of my early AIDS work, we've started to present in educational forums to help people, give people a perspective on where we are today. And it's been very, very successful. And I want to continue doing more of that. But there are a couple of things that have come up, and one of them is we're asked to do a film about a phenomenon called Charles Bonnet syndrome. 25% of people who have irreversible vision loss of some sort have hallucinations. And they might see people walking across their living room, or sitting in a chair in their living room, or they might see patterns on the wall that they know aren't there. And it's very rarely discussed, and they are usually afraid to talk about it because they think they're going crazy, and they don't want everyone else to think they're going crazy. And their doctors tend not to talk to them about it because, one, they may not know, and two, if they do know, they may not want to upset them. So these people are left in this anxious limbo. So a doctor approached me about doing a film about this, and she's going to raise the money for it. So we're excited about that. But then there's another project that I'm very interested in. I'm very concerned about the new anti-Semitism, what I call the new anti-Semitism. I'm very concerned about how the Jewish community is dealing with it. If you'll pardon the expression, the Jewish community, because there are so many Jewish communities. And I'm concerned about how the media has been handling it. The concern seems to be, how do we stop people from attacking Jews? And how do Jews protect themselves? I think that's the wrong way to go about it. I think that what we should be looking at is, how do people who live by very different standards in contiguous communities, how can they learn to understand one another and live respectfully side by side? I think that would be much more productive than labeling victim and antagonist. Not that that's not often the case, but sometimes it's more to that. One friend of mine talked about, and I love this term, situational anti-Semites and philosophical anti-Semites. And like, somebody may be anti-Semitic because they've had a very bad experience with a Jewish person. And that informs their experience and their attitude toward Jews in general. Someone else may be anti-Semitic because they were brought up with the protocols of Zion. And that's a very different thing. And I think the first kind, situational anti-Semitism, can be dealt with. And I think it's more common.
I see. Let me ask you one more question.
Mm-hmm.
You told me that you went through a lot of difficulties working on your last film.
Yeah.
what do you tell yourself in order to overcome any difficulty?
Oh, Marcelo, well, sometimes you tell yourself that you're a total failure. You know, sometimes you tell yourself that this is too difficult and you just can't do it. And there are different things that get in your way. You know, making a film is very expensive, and you try to get people, try to enlist support. And very often people don't have your vision and they can't imagine why they would support you. Luckily enough, I did get some good support, but hardly enough to do it on our own. I mean, Jim and I had to put an enormous amount of our own money into it to get it finally finished. And sometimes, I mean, there's one Sephardic organization that I thought would help us. And the head of it said to me, finally, no. And I said, but this is so important. And he said, honestly, we don't need this film. So that's rather maddening. And then a lot of Ashkenazi people didn't understand why it mattered, because they never took Sephardic too seriously. And then there's just the problem of just how difficult it was, just how intellectually burdensome it was to try to, because when you're a filmmaker, you're a journalist, you have a responsibility to be as clear as possible. And you're dealing with, you're dealing with a subject that has so many different nuances and so many different perspectives and so many different interpretations. And you have to find a line that works for you, that you feel is honest and will help your audience get through this journey. So that was exhausting.
But how do you get overcome that feeling of failure?
Well, your question was how do you get through it? So I think one of the ways you get through it is you have people who believe in you. And on a number of my films, I've had champions. Some were helpful financially. Actually, they were usually helpful to some degree financially, but they all believed in the film and they believed in what I was doing, and would encourage me when I would get down. They would say, "You're doing a great job. This is really important. You're the only one doing this kind of thing. It's got to be done." When I did Going Blind, Coming Out of the Dark about vision loss, a friend and supporter, Susan Olivo, who was the head of one of the foundations, she was just incredible. And I mean, she was more than a funder. She was a real collaborator and made sure that I was getting the right nuances and speaking to the right people, and always encouraging. My friend Jeannie Milgram, who is a Cuban crypto Jew, who traced her family, raised as a Catholic, and traced her family all the way back to Portugal. She said to me when I was in the middle of the Inquisition film, you've got to continue. No one else is trying to make this subject clear to people. What you're doing is really important. You have to continue. And it's the belief of those people that really keep you going, I think. Because we all have very fragile egos, I mean, very easy to sort of push you over. Say, no, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're doing. Oh, maybe you're right.
Yeah. Maybe it's more to overcome that feeling that we keep on insisting.
Yeah.
Joseph, I always love talking to you. I hope it's not going to be the last one. So
certainly not.
Thanks a lot.
Well, not on your side. Yeah, and I hope not on my side.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I'd like to watch your last film and say hello to Tim and to Jim. and take care of.
I will. Okay, I'll send you a link to the Inquisition film.
Yeah,
I'll send you a link.
thank you.
Big kiss. Bye.
Yeah, bye.